Hello and welcome to another episode of AAC Access All Areas. I am Ruth Jones.
And I'm Ali Battye. And today's question is it ever too late to introduce AAC? So this came from one of our listeners, I think, Ruth, didn't it? And we are trying to address those questions. Even if we take a while to address those questions, we have got your questions and we are coming round to them if we haven't addressed your particular question yet. But we read out our list of questions and we both kind of went, ooh, we liked this one.
Yeah, today felt like the day. Like this was one that captured both of our minds, I think, didn't it? To think, yeah, we can get into this today about AAC and age, because I think we often see, or I feel like in my sphere, the sometimes I think the vacuum within which I live around AAC, that I see a lot of older AAC users who perhaps fall under more of that physical disability, thinking particularly around cerebral palsy. I see quite a lot of adults using AAC, but maybe we don't see quite as much of that with our more hidden disability,
Yeah.
autistic, learning difficulties, learning disability um, clients and individuals that we support. I don't know what you
Yes.
think.
No, I would completely agree with that, Ruth, because so I'm in the process of writing 2 books at the moment. And nearly completing one, which is great. So just get one out of my brain is good. But for both of them, I was sort of like thinking, right, I'd really like to collaborate with some adult AAC users for this book. So one of them is specifically about neurodiversity affirming AAC. Um, and one of them is, it's the second edition to my first book, which was Who's Afraid of AAC? So that was very much geared towards the diversity of the AAC population. And I know loads of adult AAC users who have cerebral palsy or similar conditions. So, they might be in a powered wheelchair and have a mounted device, and that's how they communicate. So I could automatically think of 15 or 20 people in my sort of network, AAC World Network, that can contribute with that positionality of having physical disabilities and maybe sensory disabilities alongside communication disability. But when I was thinking about my neurodiversity affirming book, there are quite a lot of AAC users in the autistic world. But I would say a lot of those have come to it late in life, or they are part-time AAC users. And I was really wanting to sort of capture the experience of someone who'd used AAC from early on in their life as well, because I do think that is quite a distinct identity. And I was very fortunate that I have been able to collaborate with an absolutely amazing AAC user, and she has been able to tell me about her introduction to AAC. And interestingly, that was in her teens for robust AAC. I would say that there aren't so many role models for full-time AAC use. We might be corrected hugely. I mean, if you are out there and you are a full-time AAC user and that was introduced to you as a child, please do get in touch with us, because we'd love to hear from you. We'll maybe have you as a guest on the podcast. But I just don't feel as though it is such a well-known identity, and there aren't so many people out there. Gosh, that was long-winded. I'm so sorry, everybody. We're at the end of term and my language processing is sort of on the floor. So I'm taking a very long time to say what I need to say.
Well, I was listening intently, and I agree. And I think what's really interesting, isn't it, is when we think about autistic communication identity, we have non-speaking, which I think most people can kind of bring to the mind, or minimally speaking. And interestingly, Harriet and Kim have just written a new book, semi-speaking as a communication identity. And I know that Harriet, who is at Hat Talks on social media, identifies as a semi-speaking autistic adult and uses AAC in that part-time way, don't they? And I think when I think about a lot of the families and children that I work with, they are families and children, or the children are non-speaking,
Mm,
quite high support needs in the sense that
mm,
they're in specialist education, or they're accessing resource base, or they're on a alternative provision education other than at school um, packages. And I feel as though there isn't necessarily, again, like you say, there must be people out there, but we're
mm.
not kind of seeing them. And part of me really wishes it was within our professional boundaries, which it isn't, but to keep in touch with children that I've worked with years ago,
Mm.
you know, who were older children, um, and wondering like where are they
Yeah,
at now with AAC
yes.
use, because they were children who did have super complex needs. They were living 52 weeks of the year in a residential special
Mm,
school. So we're talking about quite, you know, complex profiles, that was the best environment for them, that was the safest environment for them to learn and develop. And I think, oh, I wonder like
mm,
what kind of things, where did that go?
mm,
Um, and I think ultimately the answer to the question is it's never too late
mm.
to
Yeah,
introduce
yeah,
AAC in a
yeah.
robust way. And if you have a child who is older, or teens and adults, where perhaps even when they were younger, iPads weren't as accessible, they
Yeah.
didn't exist, or the tech was so expensive, or even access to charities and
Mm,
benefits to support older children and adults getting access to technology
mm.
wasn't available that is now. Um, it's not too late to start learning a new language.
No, absolutely. There's no ceiling to language acquisition, and I think it's sort of like a bit of an urban myth that gets put around that brain development stops at like 25 years old, and that's just like a misinterpretation of a study that looked at people up to the age of 25 and found that their brains were still developing up to the age of 25, but it
Mm,
wouldn't have stopped overnight there. So our brains continue to develop and change, otherwise we wouldn't ever learn any new skills. So we are, what have I learnt to do? I am doing strength training now. I'm kind of like doing Zumba. So my brain is still learning new skills now. And it's the same for language. Like people learn second languages when they're older. I think we often say, oh, it's so much more difficult to learn a language when you're older. Um, and I don't know whether that is true or not, or whether it's just because if you're learning a second language when you're older, you're not like totally immersed in the environment. Whereas if, like, say you moved to a country and you were learning the language, you're hearing it all the time. I wonder whether you would actually pick it up as quickly as a child who's going to school and hearing that new language all the time. That's a wonder. I don't know what the
mm,
answer is. Um, but this has come up in my learning around Gestalt language processing, because there did used to be this idea within speech and language therapy that there was sort of like a window of development for grammar,
mhm,
especially, um, and that if a child hadn't got sort of like grammar skills by the time, I don't know what age it was, 7 or 8, then they wouldn't get grammar skills. And that sort of came from like these really one-off type studies of children who had been found living alone in the forest.
mhm.
And then I think that got like overgeneralized to all children. But what I have found in my work with Gestalt language processes, there's definitely no upper limit to grammar acquisition, that those older
Yeah.
children and teenagers and adults who have sort of been started to be supported um, with understanding their Gestalt language processing, is that suddenly their language starts to grow. and change, and they
Mm.
can acquire grammar in their late teens, early 20s, and who knows beyond, probably beyond that. So that's really reassuring to know that language continues to grow and develop. Like, we all learn new words, don't we? Like, I'm sure
Mm.
I've learnt a few words this week. I can't bring any to mind, but I'm sure I have. Um, so there's no reason to think that a child wouldn't be a child, a young person or an adult wouldn't be able to take to AAC later on in life.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting what you were talking about there is, this idea that the brain stops developing like at 25 and a lot of that research is around just the frontal lobe, isn't it? And actually that's not
Mm,
really the language areas of the brain
mm, mm,
anyway.
mm,
And when we think about development and how we kind of challenge developments in the systems, in the research, that so often research will be done and it gets shared. People take from it quite often what validates their
mhm,
perspective. And if they have a voice and a platform to then
mm.
share that research that backs up their perspective, quite often that's where these myths can start to
Yeah,
form because it's maybe one piece of research that if you look at it, we learn, don't we, in speech therapy when you're training about critical analysis. So when you're looking at research, you're looking at maybe how many participants, what was the breadth of that participation, what's the different positionalities and intersections that people within that are coming from, like how was the research conducted, what environment, you do all of this stuff and you take from it bits and pieces, and it doesn't necessarily mean you just do something or don't do something. It's part of a clinical thinking, isn't it, really,
yeah,
of weighing up the information. And so I think when we think about language learning as research, but also what we know is true from being people and
mm,
living as people is that,
mm,
you
mm,
know, that our brain constantly is forming new connections and
mm,
learning how to do new motor planning activities like your Zumba, learning new words. I'm thinking a lot about the learning that we're doing at the moment about anti-racist practice and the new vocabulary that I've had to try and
mm,
get my head around of words that I never heard of, and so I think we are always learning new skills. And actually, if we think about older AAC users, there's the term is kind of neuroplasticity, and this
mm.
idea that brain can change and shift and grow and form these new connections is that kind of research tells us, alongside our lived experience of knowing that we all are learning new things, that old phrase, every day's a school day, um, still applies to our older AAC users. So if you
Yeah,
have got, an older child, yes, a lot of what we see and capture and talk about can often be introducing it in early years or kind of in primary school. But just because nobody's thought about it for your child, or just because they haven't had access to it, it doesn't mean they don't have capacity to use it, which I guess brings us back round to that concept of presuming potential.
yes, yes, yes. And I would say, like, I'm just drawing on my previous experiences of introducing high-tech AAC to teenagers, which I don't particularly, I do have a couple of children who have are growing into teenagers on my current caseload. But I have tended to take on younger children, recently, but in my previous role, in a regional AAC assessment centre, um, our service went up to 25, and so I was often working with teenagers, and they actually would be the most joyous to introduce AAC to later in life, because they already had a lot of internalized language and were just like waiting for the tool that would allow them to share
Yeah.
that language. So, like, some of them had literacy skills, so they would straight away be able to use text to speech, which is amazing, because that does allow you to just express what you want when you want, make up new words, uh, be able to use the grammar. You've just got unending potential, limitless possibilities if you can use text to speech. But those young people who maybe um, were needing that symbol support, they already had all of the language concepts and all the knowledge of the world. So we would sometimes put an AAC device in front of them and they'd just go with it. They already had the experience of using iPads or similar devices. So they very quickly got the hang of navigation, of going into different topic folders, going back, using the backspace and the delete buttons. And so it was sometimes just a question of putting it in front of them and letting them explore it. And then, like the
Mm,
joy of seeing what came out of that, like being able to share what was in their heads, when they'd
yeah.
gone for a lot of their childhoods without that. I would say it was a favorite part of my work, actually, sometimes with those older teenagers. So yeah, I think that that would sort of like definitely be something that I would be keen to share with people. Like it's just never too late, even if a child hasn't had access to AAC earlier on in their childhood.
And I think almost once you've got children who are slightly older, things like their regulatory strategies are better
Yeah.
understood and deployed when needed. And things like hormones might have
Mm,
settled down a little bit. There's a lot
mm,
of physical growth and development that may have
mm.
happened for a
Yeah.
child. And then if at 15, 16, you're introducing AAC, sometimes just age brings them to a place where that is a really good time. And you find that they perhaps pick it up faster than
Mm.
they may have done or than others may have done when they're younger. I would still absolutely advocate for early access because the sooner
Yes.
the teacher starts,
Yes.
the better. So that's not to say wait, but I do think if you're on the fence over is it too late, there are kind of like experiences that children have had through childhood that as they're coming into adolescence, sometimes, yeah, they're in a different place hormonally, physical
Mm,
development, their
mm,
regulatory development that
mm.
does create a different vibe and a different
Yes.
space for
Yes.
them as communicators.
Yes, and executive function is developing as well, isn't it? So,
Hmm.
like the ability, I always struggle to define executive function. So, forgive again my garbled language with this. But executive function is things like being able to control what we are attending to, deciding which is most important in this moment, deciding on the next action that is needed, sort of
Mm.
like coordinating your response to different sensory inputs. Um, have I missed any, Ruth? Can you think of any other I mean, I know there's loads that I haven't covered there in terms of
Yeah, like
executive function.
generally like planning and organizing, whether that's for events, for tasks, or you're kind of organizing of structures of things. I
Mm.
always think about working memory, so that ability to
Mm.
hold something in mind and manipulate it. Um, the emotional regulation, I think you talked
Yeah,
about. I
yeah.
feel like you've got a good list there.
Yeah, I've probably
It's a
forgotten a
lot, isn't
few,
it?
but
It's
you
that.
can, if you're listening in your car or at home, add your own in there. But
Yeah.
our executive function does sort of like develop through childhood, and so if you're working with a teenager, the likelihood is that their executive function skills are more sophisticated than they were earlier on in their life. So you may well find that attention is sort of stronger, that they are able to focus more, and maybe not necessarily, but maybe they're less into that sort of like physical play type stuff and more able to um yeah, not that we need them to like sit down and concentrate, but they may just be naturally doing that and have an
Mm.
extended attention for just exploring. Interestingly, I am finding this with some of my AAC users that I've been working with for 2 or 3 years. Um, there is a marked difference now. For many of them, in terms of their play, in that I'm just thinking of one child that I've seen this morning in particular. Um, that her attention was like very flitty in the early days, I would sort of like be moving around with her, and she'd move from one activity to another, and I was sort of like going with that and modeling language accordingly. But now, like this morning, I've seen her and we had a 45-minute session. And I would say for a good 30 minutes of that session, we were looking at You Choose, which is like one of my favorite books. I love You Choose. If you're not familiar with
They're
You
awesome.
Choose, it's just like the best book for a speech and language therapist, because on each double page spread, it's like got a different category essentially. So if you could go anywhere, where would you go? And it's got a lovely, like really complex picture of like the
Mm,
mountains, the seaside, the city, into space, to a theme park. And then it's got a page for if you could have any pet, what would you choose? And it's got some like wild and wonderful pets, and then the food page. So she really loves the food page. So we spent probably half an hour looking at the food page, and there is enough to look at on that food page.
mm,
But in terms of her executive function of like, no, I really want to focus in on this page. And she was also able to be following what I was modeling on her AAC device and responding to what I was modeling as well. So if I was saying, oh, look, there's trifle there, and then I was modeling, I think it tastes delicious. And then she was responding to that. She might have, like said sweet, or then gone back to the food page and back to desserts. And she might have then said gingerbread man or something. So she was very much able to sustain that conversation for one activity as well. Again, very long-winded way of saying that her executive function skills have developed enormously. Um, Possibly in line with language and AAC, you could perhaps argue that AAC has helped with those executive function
mm,
skills. Um, but yeah, that is the joy of following children through that long-term journey, that you really, when you compare them with this time last year or this time 2 years ago, um, it's amazing. We often think that children are going to be like they are forever, and the
mm.
difference that a year makes is incredible.
Yeah. It's interesting. I work with two AAC users in that I'm holding in mind that are older, 13 and 15. And they've had AAC for a long time, but they're just sort of getting the therapy input to really enhance it. So they're kind of those kids where they were able to get a device, they've got a device, and then nobody really knew what to do with it. So it's kind of been around, and they're very good at requesting, and the team around the child had practiced building sentences for requests and what they could see and all this sort of stuff in that very education based way. But I've come in and thought about it more in that affirming, joy, child led way. And one of them in particular, we spent a lot of time, they love the Minions and like real slapstick humor stuff. And having seen them when I first started working with them, which was a few years ago, to now, they're still, I would say, a bit part-time-ish, because they don't have spoken language, but they have like gesture and lots of articulation that they use with their whole body to communicate what it is that they're thinking about. Um, but their capacity to switch between what we're doing and the AAC device, and their
Mm,
tracking when I'm modeling, and
mm,
when I'm now noticing and adding new vocabulary to their device and phrases, so things like "that's hilarious" on the
mm,
phrases page to do with their
mm,
leisure and TV watching, those sorts of things. Um, they just have more to say. They
mm,
just feel it just feels like there's a sense of humor that's developing in a different way. There's an elongation of conversation that they're enjoying that they didn't before. Um, so I think there is something about it. And thinking to the other young person that I work with, who is, gosh, I think perhaps going to year 10 or 11 now, in a special school environment, they are developing their typing skills, but they're not just requesting things, which is kind of what they
mm,
were doing when I first started
mm,
working with them. That they're commenting, they're using their
mm,
AAC to ask questions and understand responses. And I think part of that is because of that capacity to regulate and think that just comes with age and comes
Yeah.
with development. And so I think there is, you know, the short answer is it ever too late for AAC? No.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
thinking about our glimmers that we sometimes bring to it. And um my I'm thinking about glimmers that link to the theme of an older AAC user. And I'm thinking of historical children that I
Mhm.
worked with. And I may well have talked about this particular example on the podcast before, but there was a young person I was working with who would have been 16, I think, and had PECs their whole life, you know, so they were very good at I want, taking the sentence strip. They'd sort of tap each symbol and vocalize a noise as they tapped each symbol. And we got them, they don't even exist anymore, but an iPod Touch
Mm.
with Prologue Go on. And we used to do lots of programming to basically put their textbook onto Prolo Quo to go with some of the other vocab that was there. And now I know better, I would do better and do things differently. But they were at home and they kind of verbalized a sound that their family knew to mean a type of juice. And because the family had just got the iPod at home for the first time when that child had gone back for a visit home, they were like, oh, you know, show us in that way that we, you know, think about like prompting. And again, now I know, would I recommend that? Maybe not. However, what then happened was this child then said, I want a different kind of juice to the one that mum was going to get.
Mm.
And it was just like, wow, we hadn't really done much teaching. We
Mm.
hadn't really done much support. And it wasn't a complex thought that they were sharing, but they
Mm.
were 16.
Mm.
And for 16 years, every time they've made that sound, they'd patiently been given the cup of juice that the family thought that that was what it meant. And the power to be able just to ask for apple instead of blackcurrant.
Mm. Mm.
And, you know, the those moments. And actually, I'm going to have another one while I'm at it and I'm
Oh,
reflecting
do.
and thinking back on worked with. But another child who had an iPad mini and we got it in place. And I remember we were sat at sports day. It was the last day of term, and some of the children that I worked with in the special residential school were 38 weeks, so they'd go home for the school holidays. This particular child, I was sat with their parent. They were actually on my knee and they had their device. I mean, they were 15, I'm going to say, maybe a little bit younger, maybe 13. Um, and they said, they were looking through and they were using an app called Sonoflex. I don't think it
Oh,
even still
yeah.
exists, but
Mm.
they were using that. And they said car and home. And I looked at this child's mum and this mum looked at me and we both just like, I can feel myself welling up now. It was just one of those moments where you're like the power of having access to words that they just hadn't had. And their
Yeah.
mum was like, they've never asked to leave anywhere before. And this child was so passive, so prompt dependent to the point where they would pause over a chair and wait for someone to tell them to sit down because they were
Mm.
dependent on prompts so
Mm.
heavily for them to spontaneously ask to go. Even though sports day wasn't finished, literally the mum was
Mm.
like, right, we're off, and like galloped out of the building, like, we're going, let's take this advocacy that this child suddenly had. And
Mm.
that, I think, for me, those experiences I had early on in my career with introducing AAC to children who'd only ever really had PECs, who'd
Mm.
only ever had the limited number of pictures that were in that book,
Mm. Mm.
um, proved to me from probably a very early stage that it's never
Mm.
too late.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's made me think as you were talking of so there's a couple of young people that I used to work with in my old role that go to the same school as I currently go into in my independent role. And so I just see them on the corridor sometimes. And these two particular ones were both you know, as I described earlier, you put the AAC device in front of them and they just went with it straight away. And both of them started typing very quickly. They had they both had symbolized packages, but they chose to move to typing really quickly, which is a joy. Like if
Mm.
that child is developing good literacy and spelling, they automatically sort of transition to typing because they soon find that it's faster to type things, and
Yeah.
it they can express the sort of like nuances a bit better with typing than sort of like this clunkiness, I suppose, with symbols. There can be a bit of a clunkiness if you are using symbols alone. If you don't have any pre-programmed phrases, it can be particularly clunky
Uh,
to just go word by word. Um, but I see them regularly now in the corridors, and they've always got their AAC devices with them, and they're often typing as they're walking. And it's just so lovely to see them now, that is so much part of them, part of their identity. Um, and then another glimmer that I wanted to share is just around having conversations through AAC. So I've been thinking a lot
oh,
about what AAC can add to that sort of just general acquisition of language, um, and how sometimes we're using AAC as a sort of tool for exploring the world a bit more. So this week I did a home visit with a child, and we just accidentally stumbled upon the space page, and we've never been on that space page before. So I just modelled like a few words from that space page, like moon and stars, and we looked up in the sky and we couldn't see the moon or the stars. So I talked about at night we might see it, and there was a symbol for telescope, so I could model, or we can look at them through the telescope at night. And then this child was like pressing all of the planets. And so I was able to say, oh, they are all the planets in the solar system. Um, and it was just a way of like sharing information about a topic that he was really interested in. And I just know, knowing him, that when he next stumbles across the solar system on YouTube or in a book or on TV or whatever, he will now have a reference point in his AAC and kind of already know something about that topic and then be able to relate it. So I think I've been thinking about that a lot, that AAC is like just such a good language builder sometimes, of just going into new topics and just having a chat about it. I can think of another child that I used to support, where he would go into his animals page and just systematically press one button, say orangutan, and wait for me to give some information about an orangutan. So I'd say something like, oh, I love orangutans, they swing through the trees and they've got really long arms. And then he'd press like gibbon, and I'd say, oh, gibbons are really loud. They sing, and I've heard them at Port Lim. And that was absolutely like delightful for him. He was just like using that page as, give me the knowledge, tell me, what are your experiences around these animals? And he would remember it for next time and like refer to it the next time. Um, so yeah, that would be another of my little glimmers this week, just having a chat and using those pages of the AAC to have a lovely chat.
yeah. Like just it's that thing, isn't it, about seeing communication in a really broad way when we think about
Mm,
AAC. It isn't just about that request, it's about
mm,
where can it take you for
mm.
interaction rather than just
Yes.
that transaction of like you give and you get, actually that
Yeah.
genuine interaction, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, so today is our last session recording for this. We weren't going to do seasons, but the natural break in the academic year and the fact that we are off over summer feels like it's kind of leaning into this being the
Season
last episode of.
finale.
Yeah, I feel like
No
we maybe should have
dramas,
thought
no
about that and hosted
cliffhangers
this.
here though.
No, but we are going to be starting recording again in September, in the new academic year. So if people are listening and have got AAC questions, even if it feels like it's something really small, please let us know because we can add that to our list. And we're also hoping to probably over the next season start to bring in, if we can get it in the diary, bring in some other people to join our conversations, AAC users, families of AAC users, and maybe some specialist teachers and specialist AAC teachers as well. So if you listen and you're interested in what we do and you fancy coming on for a chat, then also please do let us know. We just want to keep the conversation going really about AAC and how incredible it is.
Mm. Mm. What a lovely way to finish.
Yeah, and we will wish you all a lovely summer. And we will be back again in September, chatting all things AAC.
Yes, lovely. Thank you, Ruth. It's been a joy.
Oh, it really has. I'm going to miss it over the summertime, so I look forward to September. Bye.
Bye bye.